Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. A really warm welcome to the CHAR Annual Conference 2021. My name is Ralf Süthoff. I'm the director of the Center for Humanitarian Action, and I welcome you to our conference titled 5 Years Grand Bargain, Time to Restart Humanitarian Reform. I'm really happy to welcome you to this topic. Also on a personal note, I recall 5 years ago in my former life as a director of the UN World Food Programme, I entered a meeting with Valerie Amos, then, as many of you will know, director of OCHA and one of the key reform drivers in the run-up to the summit. And in this meeting, Valerie told us in a remarkable phrase, well, what's up at the summit? The humanitarian system will reform or die. This sounds a bit gloomy and maybe is until today for some of you, but it tells us also a story what has been for many experts at stake 5 years ago and gives us a sense on the challenges discussed and maybe also to the ones we have to deal with right now. If we look at the COVID-19 pandemic and the challenges it has reinforced, I think there are at least 2, 3, 4 points questioning if the system is fit for purpose. 3 of these points we might quickly touch on. I mean, let's take a look. Is the system fit for purpose in a world where the number of people in need is booming while the donor funding is rather decreasing? Is the system fit for purpose in a world where at the same time humanitarian access issues, especially for international aid workers in this pandemic, are getting worse and worse, and it's more and more challenging? So we transfer more and more work, and by that risks, to local partners and try to be accountable to them. But are we really in a world where, thirdly, we live where the decision-making is still centered in the global north, while we decided most of these things for people in the global south? Against this backdrop in 2016, as many people say, maybe the most ambitious humanitarian reform agenda ever has been agreed in the most inclusive way, as partners came together from governments, from the UN side, from the NGO world, and agreed on a grand bargain, a reform agenda, which was at the same time a kind of a mutual promise. In particular, a promise between donors of aid and aid providers, a promise to exchange 2 things. On the one side, it was striking like a deal that donors would share more trust into the aid providers, and they would exchange it against more transparency of what they do. Trust of the donors was to be provided by far more flexible, reliable, multi-year funding, which would be provided in a less bureaucratic, less mushrooming reporting world with templates and individual from each donor, with reporting year by year, with templates and project applications to be filled out year by year in a world where protected crisis lasts in many countries for now 20, 25 years. And that was to be exchanged against more transparency by the aid providers, by the aid actors, providing value for money, demonstrating that what they do is value for money, demonstrating what the outcomes of their aid is, and not only the output of their aid supplies. And by ensuring that local actors are more and more in the driver's seat and focusing less on the funding competition and more on so-called collective outcomes. What is the overall objective of our joint operation in a crisis? So overall, the aim was to reform an aid system which some called broke at that time, some called it broke, and some called it even broken. And today, many say, well, is it maybe broke and broken at the same time? So 2016 it was agreed to tackle these challenges with a 5 years time frame, and it will expire in a few weeks. So it's time to take a look and to take stock what has been achieved in the past 5 years. We are very excited to discuss this, and we believe even virtually, again, only virtually, our annual conference is the perfect place to discuss this in a light, for example, on the government side of a top donor, Germany, which has increased its humanitarian funding since the summit by more than 400%, which is an astonishing boom and has an ambitious reform agenda and engagement in the international arena. And besides, we as CHAR only founded 2019 thanks to support by MSF, Caritas International and Diakonie Katastrophenhilfe. Feel a bit like this reform debate is sort of the DNA also of our new think tank. So 1 month ahead of the next meeting on the grand bargain against the decision, 1 month ahead of the decision if there should be a grand bargain 2.0, and if there will be a further step taken, we want to look for more or less 2 days on a couple of key topics, and hoped we could arrange for you an ambitious and wonderful agenda, which my colleague Darina, who's the co-lead of this conference, is going to share with you. Hi, Darina.
Thank you, Ralph. Also from my side, thank you for joining us today. And indeed, there is a couple of hopefully interesting discussions coming up in the next 2 days. We will start this conference off with an opening panel and opening discussion, where Ralph will discuss some of the more general insights to the humanitarian reform process as such, together with Smriti Patel, Klaus Sørensen, and Farida Bena. After this, we will have the opportunity to dive more deeply into some of what we think most important topics to the grand bargain. And we will start this off later today with our panel on the new roles for intermediaries in a localized humanitarian system. And in this panel, we will hear from a dedicated group of experts from various local organizations and how they perceive their international partners' approaches to localization. Tomorrow, we will continue as we approach the issue of financing of the humanitarian reform. And in the panel, The Donor Paradox, Reform Drivers Blocking Reform, we will discuss with the donors their promises to provide a flexible and reliable funding to allow effective assistance and value for money. Thereby, we will not only talk to institutional governmental donors, but also about UN agencies and INGOs and their role as a donor vis-à-vis local actors. And finally, we will have 3 30-minute spotlight sections tomorrow to end our discussion. And therein, we will highlight some cross-cutting issues that we think should be incorporated and need to be reflected upon in the upcoming Grand Bargain 2.0. And these will be gender, innovation, and the underlying assumptions and ethics of the humanitarian reform process. Before I hand over back to Ralph, let me quickly introduce some housekeeping rules. First of all, if you're joining us on Zoom today, please keep your camera and microphone switched off. Of course, all of your comments and thoughts and questions are still welcome. My colleague Andrea will monitor the chat, where you can post all of your inputs if you like. She will introduce your inputs later in each of the sessions in the Q&A section. Furthermore, please tweet and post about us on social media using the hashtag #GB21. If you feel inspired to exchange and network more and you want to connect with your peers, you can do that via our Slack channel. We put up a room where you can network and exchange, most likely like in a in-person conference. Last but not least, to make sure that all our discussions are not lost in the wide range of technically recorded conference talks available online right now, we are very happy to are joined by a graphic designer today. Nicoline Liu will join us from South Africa, and she will put live graphic records online, and we will refer to them throughout the sessions. That's all from my side. With that, back over to you, Ralph.
Thanks so much, Darina. So let's really jump into it. And I'm really honored to welcome our opening speaker in our keynote dialogue, Smriti Patel. Smriti Patel is from India and the founder of the Global Mentoring Initiative. She's been working in the sector, as most of you will know, for more than 25 years. And she's been a key figure in the run-up to the World Humanitarian Summit, organizing a lot of consultations, sharing the inputs at the summit. And she's a member of the reform group Charter for Change. And she's representing, until today, the Alliance for Empowering Partnership, in the grand bargain. So she's really, really into it, and who could be a better speaker for us to make sure we listen to the ones who haven't been heard that much in the process, to the representatives from the Global South in this event. And we start this talk with her right now on a key issue and a really personal note, as I understand. Smruti, many thanks for joining us. First of all, good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon.
Smruti, thanks for joining us. Smruti, when we talked last time, you shared with me that there is indeed a personal angle right now, given your home region, your home country, India, and the really bad news we hear from there related to the pandemic. I understand that this is even enforcing, in a way, what you have been looking at in the humanitarian world and why you think change is needed, if that's a fair summary. But please, over to you for your initial input. What has motivating you to engage in this whole process, and what's at stake?
Thank you so much. And it's a real honor to be here. And thank you for inviting me to exchange my perspective on this. So, yeah, what really motivates me? I would say that, I made a deliberate choice to join the aid sector. I used to work in the business sector for many years. So it's a real kind of from the heart, wanting to join, to do and make a difference in the world. I would say I've worked with a lot of INGOs, local organizations, and the UN. So I know the system in its all different layers. But I think the particular thing that sticks in my mind of why this path is really being involved in the tsunami evaluation in 2006. After the tsunami, there was a multi-sector evaluation. And I was involved in the impact of international response on local capacities. I have to say that really opened my eyes, because what I was hearing before was, oh, we don't have enough money, that's why we can't respond in the right way. But what I saw was we had plenty of money during the tsunami response, and yet we still had a long way to go. I had thousands of conversations with local people and organizations. And I think that's what really, I would say, set me on the path to looking at how can we increase accountability to affected populations, and we give more resources to local and national actors to be able to act. Now, it doesn't mean that it's one thing or the other, right? Because we all need each other, and I want to give that as a clear message. But how we work together is so, so important. I think my work with Humanitarian Accountability Partnership for 6 years put me in contact with many international organization staff at local level, right, in different countries. But also, I saw how the local organizations and the communities were treated as well. And actually really was aware, a lot more aware about the inequity in the system. And how do we make sure that we really work in an accountable way? So that's in a way also what kind of set me on this path. And having worked there for many years, and in 2015, I got involved in the kind of the consultation process, pre-WHS, right, in the different region. And one of my roles in starting to look at how we can create a southern network of organization, right? We've got many international networks, but how do you create a southern one? I went to many countries and had consultations with local organizations, and that really gave me an insight into what are some of the challenges for local organizations and what do we need to do. And that, I think that's what kind of gives me the insight into what are the things that are needed to be done. I would say once the Grand Bargain, being at the World Humanitarian Summit, and all the processes, leading up to it is a really positive initiative. And actually, local actors were very excited about what was happening in terms of these commitments, because for the first time, localization is not a new commitment. It's been there since 1994, 95, right? But this time they really saw it being activated, actually being put somehow into commitments. And that was really exciting to see that actually happening, written into a commitment. I would say, though, that in terms of the real action, and you talk about 5 years on, right? So that was a great step and a great platform, actually, to have the donors, the INGOs together, and the UN agencies together. But we know that there was a lack of real involvement of local organizations in the grand bargaining process. And I would say also, yes, you had Western governments involved, but actually a lot of the Southern governments are not involved in that process either. So there is a gap there. But I think the key thing is about how can we going forward, how can we make sure there's more involvement of local and national organizations in this whole process is absolutely key. I would say that one thing that really strikes is that the commitments are very clear, but how is that information and where is the awareness at country level of those commitments? So in a way, there's this global awareness, but it's not awareness at country level. All the institutions who are signed up to the grand bargain, how are they implementing in their organization? Is it institutionalized? I know that this is a question for the German government, having committed to that. Their own administration, how is it doing? And German NGOs, we have been as a global mentoring initiative, we've done a lot of work with German NGOs on this issue as well. And they're now reflecting on how can they institutionalize that commitment, which is really, really important. I would say the lack of understanding about what localization is, also concretely, not this blah blah, but real concretely, is really, really important. And having done the research for the START network, because really looking at concretely what does that mean in action, we started looking at, through the consultation process, we started saying, okay, what does it really mean? And through the consultation process, we developed this 7 dimensions framework. And most people know localization commitment is 25%, right? But actually there's a lot more than that. There's a whole issue of quality of relationship. And how do you make sure that it's not just about quantity of funding, but quality of funding? How do we make sure that participation is there? And they're really part of the key decision-making processes, that they're also involved in the coordination mechanism and making decisions. At the moment, the coordination is very top-down. We are, when there's a big humanitarian response, and I've been involved in some in Chechnya, in Afghanistan, also in the Indian earthquake, the big machinery, the surge capacity, international surge capacity arrives. And I know in the tsunami evaluation, they said, actually, we had a second tsunami when the international system arrived. Right. It really overwhelmed us, right? So how we behave in the way we deploy is also very key. Are we coordinating ourselves? Or are we, helping? The whole point is that you show solidarity with the affected population in the country. So should we not be coordinating with them rather than they take part in our coordination mechanism? So I think these are some of the issues that we really need to think about. Of course, there's a whole issue of standards and policies, and how are these policies develops with information from the ground, right? From the local organizations and others who let's face it, they're there before disasters, they're during disasters, they're after disasters, right? And in many places, there's no international response, right? It's only locals who are responding. So somehow we put ourselves as a center as international actors, but we're not. If it's a drop in the ocean what we do, so let's put ourselves into a bit moderate position. So I
Ruthie,
think,
can I just quickly ask you on one point you mentioned before we maybe deep dive a bit more into the localization issue? You mentioned the tsunami experience, and for many, indeed, that has been a key background regarding the run-up to the summit and why a ambitious reform agenda is needed. So what would you say? There have been at least 2 schools in the run-up to the summit. Do we look at a humanitarian system which needs really fundamental change, as some governments believed and local representatives indeed did as well? Or do we look at a fairly effective humanitarian system which surely needs some reforms, which, for example, was rather the stake of the German government? What has been your view?
okay, so, for me, as I said, I've been in this system for a long time. I've seen a lot of reform processes in the humanitarian system, in the aid system. And it seems that we are tinkering at the edges and somehow we're not getting there. So I think there is a need for a fundamental rethinking in some aspects, because we know, and I think, in your report, you also point out, the Black Lives Matter movement has really brought into frame some fundamental attitudes and behaviors that need to change. Because without that change, I don't think that anything will change. So I think that, and the whole movement around decolonization of aid is really should be helping us to think in a new way of how we respond. So I think there are some things where we need fundamental change. There are others where, we can work with what we have while the change is happening, because, you cannot just break everything overnight, otherwise things will not work. And when there is an emergency, what will we do? And I think COVID situation has shown us that, right? I mean, if I look at what's happening in India and other places around the world right now, international help is needed, the funding is needed to local level. But right now, that is still not working. So we need to work in a way to make sure that the blockages that are there, there's a positive attitude to change. And I think sometimes it's about the mind shift. I think in your report, you also talk about this. But, if we are always talking about, we want to do this, but, and there's always a but, right? That means, humanitarians are meant to be innovative. You're supposed to be finding solutions. So let's not have any more buts, but let's have a can-do attitude, right, and behavior. I think the second thing is, for me, humanitarian response is about solidarity, and how are we showing solidarity? And I think over the years, I've seen such bureaucratization of our systems, and I think that needs to change. How do we show more solidarity from the heart, and really, looking at how we can make this easier for ourselves? Because I see and I work with people in the system, and I can also see the stress levels, right, of people who are working in the system. The well-being of people in the system is being affected. So how do we make sure that we really debureaucratize some of these things? And I think the last one I will say is a bit of the will to change, because as you said, Ralph, there's been a lot of change processes in the past, but where is that will? And this is not only for one level, right? So the donors need to do something about changing. They have to have the will to change. The INGOs and the international actors, the UN system, they have to have the will to change. And then I'm not going to leave out, local actors also have to do their bit, right? They have to show the good stewardship as well. And so we have to work together to make that change. I don't think it's just something for one actor or another. I think one of the things that would really make a difference is really having a bit more deeper conversation. I feel like we're always just surfacing, scratching the surface. What I've seen through the grant bargain process is that there are a lot of pilots, right? There have been as projects that have been instituted. There's lots of research. I think Global Mentoring Initiative has published there's about 14 pages of bibliography just for research on localization. But what I see is the plane has not taken off. We remain grounded. So what is, what is the value of those pilots? We have to, so the donors have to keep an eye on that as well. What are they funding and how effective they are? Because somehow we need the longer term vision. And I think I would say that going forward for the grant bargain, 5 years, if you talk about change process, it's not enough. And now I hear that we are thinking about 2 years. So I think we need, just like the SDGs, we're talking about 2030. If you look at, the Sendai framework is 2030. We need to have a longer term process that really looks at, the changes that need to be done. So let's think a bit longer term. That this ad hoc approach is not working. So I think we need to really reflect on that.
Smriti, can I quickly comment on a point you mentioned? Before we maybe analyze a bit deeper, what is the reason why we don't progress faster than we hoped for, and why are so many actors still on the brakes as you analyze, and why we don't go beyond the pilot level, as also our chart paper, which we just published on the grant bargain, confirms? What would you say if you look at localization itself? What could be a key step, or what is even anecdotal evidence? Why are things going wrong? There's always the talk about funding. At least 25% of the funding should go to locals. Of course, it hardly happens. Only 10 donors so far, more or less, have really accomplished. But what would be the key step from your point of view, to be taken in the next 1 or 2 years? And maybe then we look at it a bit more and why we progress so slowly.
I think the key part is we get too much focused on the percentage of funding. I think the focus on equitable relationship, power. We haven't even come to the whole discussion on power in this system. And I think that's where the key lies, because unless we start talking about that and really looking at what does equitable relationship look like, where decisions are made together, because unless those decisions are made together about what's appropriate at country level, I think we're missing the trick. So I think that these two things are really important. I also think that looking at more also local funding or other types of funding which can be unlocked, where the local actors are also, because INGOs and the UN system, they have big machinery on fundraising, but I think this is not available for local actors. So how can we do more for them to be able to access those funds? And I think that if we really recognize, because I often get this feedback from people, oh, there is capacity deficit. Please stop that. There is no capacity deficit. Yes, there are some places where the technical capacity is missing, but actually, if we have the wrong glasses on, we'll never see the capacity. I saw that in the tsunami response. So we need to recognize, we've been training people for many years. Where is the effectiveness of your training and capacity building all these years? I've seen these in budgets in many organizations. So, collectively, what have we built if we are still talking about capacity gap? So maybe we also need to look at that. And I think two things. The collective capacity, I think you mentioned a bit earlier, we keep looking at individual stuff, right? But collectively, it doesn't go very far because we are all competing with each other. If I see in any response, and I'm going to talk about the Rohingya response, all these international actors are competing with each other for funding for Rohingya response. And in that fight, local organizations and local capacities being left out. We need to really focus on where is that capacity? How do we reinforce that? And I think one of the phrases from the ground bargaining was reinforce, not replace. So let's get focused on that and really work on that to augment that capacity. I think one of the other things is in many Western countries, right? Institutions matter. And, if we don't provide institutional support to local organizations so they have a strong organization that can cope with this, I think we are missing the trick. It's no good just giving them technical capacity, which then they can't maintain afterwards, because many of them had capacity trainings over the past years, but they lose their staff because there's not, they cannot maintain the staff. They cannot maintain their infrastructure because they're not getting the overheads or core costs that's required. So there are all these different things that we can make changes on to really, to move forward.
Before we enter maybe in more detailed discussion also on the actors themselves, when you kindly join our panel in a minute with a top donor representative and a top INGO representative, that will be a really interesting topic, I believe. Maybe for now, if you could take a look at, there is the issue of, is this about individual behavior, about better communication and exchange and attitudes, and to which way is it a systematic issue and a change policy issue? Some people say, well, this system can't change from within. And I am happy to quote, for example, the network ALNAP in 2016, analyzing, there are powerful organizational incentives for retaining the current system. The system is tied to funding, and the top-down system is felt to serve the interests of the people at the top. So what's your hope? How can this change? And from where could change be initiated in a more forceful way you hope for?
I think it's time, the demand from the ground, it has to be, right? So the demand from the ground can also make that change. Of course, the donors are a key part of this equation as well. And how they are providing funding and how they are making decisions which affects system-wide approach. That's really important, because often when there is a crisis, there are operational decisions made at local level, but there's not a collective decision. Which, for example, if you collective made a decision between those donors, right? That actually we have to fund in a way that supports localization, then that will happen. But right now, that I think there's a very disjointed way of operating. We have good initiatives like the good Humanitarian Donorship Initiative and other things, but how are those donors coming together to have a bit more strategic approach to this is really, really important. And then, of course, how are they actually making that accountable? Because what we see is there are many of these commitments that are made left, right, and center, but there's no accountability. How are they being accountable for the commitments they've made and reporting on that, so the local actors can see that there's an action and make them accountable from. And this is why I say, it's really important to have local actors at the table and the demand from the ground for that accountability, because all this action is taking part in their countries. We are a guest when we arrive. So can we behave as a guest rather than a master? I think this is what I mean by behavior and attitude change. We often have very dominating attitudes and behaviors. If we were a bit more humble and if we were really working from the heart in terms of solidarity, we would go there to really think about how can we help rather than, take over. And that's what I've seen in many different countries where I have been part of the response in the INGO sector, right? So I've seen that from the ground. So I think that attitude and behavior of the donors, are donor administration looking internally? Have you put the mirror to themselves to say, what are their attitudes and behaviors? Often I see deficit thinking, right? Or lack of trust when they talk about local actors. There's a lot of negative narratives about distrust, about risk, and all of this. Well, the risk we know exists in every place, and the recent reports on PSA and others, we know that corruption and things happen even in INGOs and UN agencies, right? And when that happens there, it's big time because they have much, much more money than local organizations. Yet, it's the local organizations who always get penalized or stigmatized on this. So I think we need to change that. It's really time for that step change in terms of our attitudes and behaviors.
Many thanks, Ruti. Maybe final question for this round. If you look at the grand bargain process itself, to which extent has that been inclusive also with respect to Global South representatives? I mean, there have been 10 times more signatories from the international world than from the local one, and not that much openness to invite more actors from the Global South, I recall. But is that your impression? If you've been in the process yourself, how did that reflect in the discussions and in the process? Why has that been an issue?
So look, so the run-up to the WHS and when the grand bargain, actually the consultations really was an open process where there were a lot of local organizations involved. And suddenly when the signatories, when the actual bargain was formed, there were no local organizations really involved in there. And I think that was a big mistake. And once it was formed and the signatories, I think that whole process, even now, if you look at the governance of the grand bargain, it's only international organizations. There are no local actors present in the governance, the facilitation group. I think going forward, that needs to be democratized and more local organizations need to be represented there. I think the second one is that often, and this just carries on, right? Often, even to get invited to some of these processes, it's internationals who are making decisions on which local actor can be at the table. And I think that's also a problem because it means that it's always the international deciding who can be at the table and how they can participate, how much they can participate. Look, in the Chart for Change process, where we have signatories, we also made sure that, we have endorsers at the same, the partners need to be at the table because if otherwise it's one-sided. It's about, I'm the judge and the jury. If I'm the one who's making commitments and I'm the one who's reporting, who's there to contest that? Who's there to verify actually this is happening or not? We need local actors at the table because the money is raised in the name of the populations where these crises are happening. Money is not for just the organizations, right? If you are raising money and funds in the name of the local populations, then their representatives need to be at the table to make those decisions. I mean, for me, that's the bottom line. It's your accountability. And we need to democratize a lot of these processes. Even in the, when I see the work streams, we have a lot of local actors now because we've pushed for it, right? In the localization work stream. But what about the other work streams? They're still all dominated by international actors. And I think going forward, we really need to make sure the facilitation group at every level, there must be local representation. And, people always say, oh, but, there's so many local organizations, who do we pick? Well, how do you make decisions? There are many INGOs in all places, but you come together and you make decisions about who will represent. It's the same, leave it for the local actors also to have the same processes. And, The other thing I always get here, and I get really irritated by this, is, oh, but you're also fragmented. Well, I'm sorry to say this. I have been in the international system for many years, and international actors are very fragmented. If you see the same organizations in different initiatives, and they have different views, in those initiatives. So let's make sure that we're not using double standards, right? Okay. One rule for you and one rule for the local organizations. Let's just reflect on that. And I also want to say this about the humanitarian standards, the humanitarian principles, because what I often hear is, lecturing local organizations about humanitarian standards, but we see, and local organizations very often see, that they're actually getting their funding. We see this in Syria, we've seen this in many other places in the Palestine now. So, on one hand, they're giving the humanitarian aid, but they're not, I think that whole thing about, reducing the need, part of the grand bargain, is nowhere to be seen, right? So where is that political action and standing up for the rights of people? When you are funding humanitarian operation, but at the same time you're weaponizing some actors who actually perpetrate violence against the population, well, that's not showing those standards in practice. So I would really, going forward, I would like that, really to see how they're practicing the principles.
Thank you so much, Smruti. I think that has been a really powerful intro on your views and what needs to change. And let me take the chance now to share your insights with a top donor, with a former top donor, and if he can agree to various points you made before we surely re-engage you in the debate and come back also to the localization challenges. Let me introduce to you the panel now, following quickly naming that we will discuss later on with Farida Bena, the Sherpa of the IRC, the Grand Bargain, but now turning for a start to Klaus Sørensen. Klaus has been the Director General of ECHO, the top donor, the humanitarian arm for humanitarian assistance of the European Union. He's been in charge until 2016 for ECHO policies, and can explain to us from various angles today engaged with top NGO, with NRC, where I think, Klaus, we've just stolen you from the Export Board meeting, and apologies to NRC for that. But many thanks for joining us. Welcome, Klaus.
Thank you for having me, Ralph. It's a delight to be with you, and wonderful to see Smruti again. Really nice to have you in the panel.
Klaus, you heard...
you want me to react, or Ralph, over to you?
Yes, please. Klaus, you heard Smruti's point of views, and she talked a lot about donors. Maybe if you want to quickly comment on that before we take maybe a step back and ask what has been your background when you engaged very much in the run-up to the World Humanitarian Summit and in the pre-processes, and why you believed major reforms needed. But maybe you want to comment on Smruti for a start.
No, just. I mean, first of all, I would love to come to a gathering in the Global South and be the guest, and Smruti would be the master. So, and I really appreciate what she says, that we have too many buts, and we should move into a can-do mode. So agreement on that. The attitude of donors has not been necessarily very helpful. I have to say that the Trump years has meant that we actually didn't know where we had the Americans. Let's be very honest about it. So a lot of others were sort of playing a little bit for time, what goes on, et cetera, et cetera. I think in that period, actually, Ralph, we can criticize, but the German government, for one, was one that stepped up and also put more money into the system. But if you look at it sort of globally, there was a reluctance to be on. We realized, a lot of people realized, that we had to give much more power to a number of the issues that I'm sure we will discuss also with his group, although we have sometimes too many groups, to dig into accountability and to make sure that the voice of the beneficiaries actually is channeled out as a powerful motivation, that voice is heard loud and clear. But perhaps, Ralph, you mentioned the background, and maybe it's boring for the audience, but I could give a very fast rundown of the situation before the Istanbul summit, and why I was actually very much in favor of having that summit. You know where we were in 2015 in Addis Ababa. We had the SDGs that were replacing the Millennium Development Goal. We had SDGs which are addressed both to developing countries and to industrialized countries, because it's an agenda for all of us. We have financing that we know will go, of course, to developing countries, but mainly to those that can absorb, not necessarily to the weakest. And then we have the climate agenda, which again is a global agenda. So I said to myself, where's the conference for the weakest of the weakest? Where is it? Why have the most destitute people, the bottom 10% in getting the UN system actually to support this process? Because there were the feel that the taxpayers' money goes through a number of processes that do not really land where they have to land. So the agenda, in my view, was well structured, well thought out. We had all the elements. But then we ran into this period, and I was very unhappy that Kristalina Georgieva had to go to the International Monetary Fund. I'm very happy for them.
The former EU commissioner, just to explain.
Exactly, and she was the eminent person. She was the first eminent person, and she pushed a lot. But if you have a huge job like that coming on you, it's just not easy to herd the cats and to create the political momentum. Mm-hmm. She did what she could do, and Sigrid Kaag, splendid person, obviously suffering under the fact that we have an American administration that is basically not really engaged in all of that, also had a limited scope for action. So in a way, I believe now we have the conditions for a reset. We have a condition for looking at what has been done. And that's why I looked at what has been done. And I'm happy definitely with certain items. I'm happy for transparency. I'm fairly happy with cash. So cash has been rolled out widely, et cetera, et cetera. But I have to say on cash, I'm also furious that the UN system has not yet found out who is the main agency responsible for that. So there's work to be done. I'm annoyed that we haven't found ways to engage the local responders more. I know that there are legal issues, there are bureaucratic issues, but with a political will to solve them, you can overcome them. And we can discuss that a little bit later in how that should be done. So you can go through the whole list of deliverables, and you will see a glass half full, half empty. Sometimes you will see more of an empty glass. Sometimes you will see that it's not so bad on the transparency and so on. But my advice is, don't throw the baby out with the bathing water. Don't give up, and don't get distracted by just focusing on, let's say, localization, which is very close to my heart. But let's not make that an excuse for not solving the problem of reporting, solving the legal problem, solving the issue of multi-sector needs assessments, where agencies have to cooperate in getting all of this done. Because if we get distracted, we miss an opportunity, and the opportunity has to be seized now.
Mm-hmm. Many thanks, Klaus. We come back to this later if you don't mind. I would invite now Farida Bena to join the discussion and then link you guys up. Welcome, Farida. Many thanks for joining us. You are for 20 years in the sector. You are the humanitarian policy lead of the International Rescue Committee since 2017, and you are the Sherpa for the Grand Bargain for years, so you know it all by heart. IRC has published, I believe today, a statement on the Grand Bargain. And we could start with that. Welcome, Farida. Please let us know
Thank you.
how
Thank you
engage.
very much for having me, and it's a pleasure to meet you all. Yes, I mean, later today we are publishing our position paper on the future of the Grand Bargain, in which we echo many of the messages that Klaus and Sruti have just said. So I can only agree with what has been said so far, and specifically, we agree with the direction of travel that the Grand Bargain 2.0, so to speak, is taken, that is to zero in on localization and quality funding for the next iteration of the Grand Bargain. But we also suggest a number of recommendations to really go deeper and make sure that in the next 2-year period, we really secure the political agreement at principles level. Some of the challenges that Smruti and Klaus mentioned really have to do with the fact that since 2016, when the Grand Bargain was first established, many of the principles, by which I mean heads of agencies, CEOs of NGOs, really the top decision makers, have been largely absent from Grand Bargain discussions, leaving it to their technical teams, and sometimes different, if not competing teams, to address huge challenges at the technical level. So we have done a lot of technical work. Some of it is excellent. I agree that we should weigh the baby with the bathwater. But there's only so much. Now, 2/3 of all humanitarian assistance go through UN agencies. And while this is good for coordination purposes and also makes life easier for a lot of bilateral donors, what happens is that 65-66% of humanitarian assistance is sometimes bottled up in UN bureaucracy and takes months, as we experienced last year with the COVID response, to trickle down to the front lines. And in many cases, IRC, but also our partners, have ended up waiting 8 months until they've started receiving UN funding, pass-through funding. In a situation like COVID, this has had incredibly negative consequences, as we all know and witnessed. This can no longer happen. COVID has only exacerbated a trend that we have seen since the Grand Bargain was first established, which is that humanitarian needs are far outpacing humanitarian funding. And if we don't prioritize reaching the frontline implementers, be they local actors, the primary responders, international organizations, or a partnership of the two, we are going to continue to experience funding that is short-term to address long-term challenges, funding that is not good enough because it's not of good quality, it's not flexible, and funding that is not fast enough. So we really need to address the volume, the quality, the speed of funding if we want to see major reforms happening in the Grand Bargain. And I hope that this second iteration, whether it's 2-year, 5-year long, is really going to tackle this crucial issue. We need to flip the humanitarian financing model on its head.
Many thanks, Farida, for your clear and straightforward words. Now Andrea will join me, who has monitored the chat, and so the audience should have a say, and I make a bit space for Andrea. And don't be surprised, and don't blame me, by the way, to keep looking a bit down at you. The screen is a bit down, and that's why the camera is far more up. And it's the hottest day in Germany for about 8 months, so that's why we keep sweating here. Sorry for that. Andrea, what's going on in the chat?
Thank you, Ralf. The chat is very, very lively. We're very happy for an engaged discussion. As always, it starts right now, so please bear with me. I'm trying to cluster all the questions that have been asked so far. I think the best frame that I could locate was the intersection between quantitative and qualitative engagement. It's a question that relates to most of the points that have been made by Smuti, Klaus, and Farida in terms of solidarity versus bureaucratization, or Klaus's saying of not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, or Farida's comment on the cash work stream being excellently implemented in a technical way, but the political level is still missing. So Rajan Jimire from Malteser International asked the question, one issue also observed is that the Grand Bargain has looked more on quantitative measures, such as how much funding channeled and how many engagement, trust, leadership within most of your questions and comments, and also where you might have a little bit into the round, and I will come back later with more questions.
Okay. Many thanks, Andrea. Sruti, would you like to jump on that one?
Okay. So two things that kind of strikes me. One of them is really when I was listening earlier, the competition. So, the competition in the system and the incentive by the donors in the way that, the IDON and others are competing for funding. So that sets the kind of the mindset of expansion, right? And what I see is a lot of the organization, if I look at the directors of organizations, how are they assessed? It's by them expanding the fund for the organization, right? That's how they're assessed. So that doesn't produce something which looks at, okay, how can we work so that we are expanding our partner base rather than us, right? And I think at country level, this is so important, because we see now international organizations localizing, they're registering at country level, and that creates less space for CSOs. I can tell you, we keep talking about that, a healthy democracy needs civil society organizations. Well, we don't let them grow at the local level. Give them space. You might, take less space at the table. So, for example, in Bangladesh right now and in some of the other spaces, when I've been there in the coordination mechanism, it's all INGOs, right? Maybe some of the INGOs need to step back, make space for
about affected populations that humanitarians need to access. So this question is circling around the question of access.
Many thanks, Andrea. I think, Farida, to the question of who are the local actors actually and how should they be defined, you might have something to say. But Klaus, be reassured, it will be your turn.
Don't worry. It's okay.
Well, we have our own in-house definition of local actors, and that's, I think, another issue with the Grand Bargain, that 5 years on, we still don't have agreed definitions on a number of key concepts like localization, like local actors. It would be good in this next phase to really, again, talk to each other at political level and understand why there hasn't been an agreement. Work with the 25% target also has never been clearly defined. What does humanitarian funding mean? Just, I put it as an aside. But for us, for IRC, local actors are national, local community-based actors, including civil society, but also local authorities, actors that are locally rooted in the country in question. So we're not talking about international organizations registering as local actors. And for us, this is really important. We try to establish these relationships in terms of quantity, and we are now embarking on our next strategic plan running until 2033 when IRC turns 100. and we are engaging to develop and have hundreds of local partnerships in place, partners in the countries where we operate, but also increasingly we want to develop a better quality of these partnerships, because in all of this, we do want to stress the importance of taking a gender and a gender-based approach. And that is something that I also hope the Grand Bargain 2.0 will address more consistently. And we are going to